Hello and welcome to On Geopolitics, this podcast from the Centre for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge, hosted by Professor Ali Ansari and me, Suzanne Rain. And we're joined today by one of our regular guests, Dr. John Nilsson-Wright, who is head of the Japan and Koreas programme at the Centre for Geopolitics and Associate Professor of Japanese Politics at the University of Cambridge. And John happened to be in South Korea on the 3rd of December last year when martial law was declared. And we decided we ought to get him on because the problem has continued since then. And in fact, I should say that we recorded this on Tuesday, the 14th of January. And that evening, it became clear that the President Yoon, had become South Korea's first sitting president to be arrested after the investigators scaled the barricades to arrest him. So the conversation that we're about to have happened before his arrest, but we think we're still putting it out because everything else is completely valid, and John's insights into what's happening and why it happened are totally fascinating.
John, very good to have you here. So tell us, John, what on earth happened on the 3rd of December?
Well, all of us were taken by surprise. I actually fortuitously happened to be in Seoul on December 3rd. I was there for an academic conference and discovered the news at 10:30 that President Yoon had gone on national television and declared that he was putting in place martial law. This is unprecedented, right? The last time it happened in South Korea was in 1980, when the then military leader of the country, Chun Do-han, the successor to Park Chung-hee, the authoritarian leader who had ruled South Korea with an iron fist from the early 1960s to late 1970s, replaced by Chun. Chun himself had brutally suppressed political pressure from democratic students. So this was, it seemed, an attempt to do something similar. President Yoon, annoyed by the opposition party in the National Assembly, declared martial law and then sought to prevent the assembly from meeting to vote on the question of whether this declaration by the president was in fact going to stand. And as you may recall, the opposition rallied with a few conservative members of the National Assembly, and most importantly of all, public opinion rallied, and there were ordinary South Koreans showing up at the National Assembly to ensure that this vote would go ahead. However, the president had dispatched a considerable number of troops on helicopters and in armored personnel carriers to try and prevent this vote from going ahead. They surrounded the National Assembly. This was all happening on live television in an effort to block the vote from going through. Fortunately, that did not in fact happen. And the assembly members were able to prevent the troops from entering the assembly. The vote was taken with a handful of conservative members voting with their Democratic Party opposition party members to reject the martial law declaration. And then we had a standoff for about 6 hours through the night until President Yoon finally bowed to public pressure and the actions of those brave Democratic politicians and rescinded his martial law declaration. But of course, the story didn't end there, because then in turn, the Assembly over the next few days, over about a period of a week, sought to address this unprecedented action by the president, because declaring martial law, of course, is not a day-to-day feature of politics in any political system. And the opposition parties then decided in turn to seek to impeach the president. To impeach the president requires a 2/3 majority in the National Assembly. The Democratic Party didn't have those numbers. It needed the support of the Conservative People's Power Party to back them. And extraordinarily, when the Assembly convened about a week after the announcement, the Conservative Party boycotted the proceedings. All of this was happening in the full glare of public attention, with huge rallies on the streets of Seoul by large numbers of Koreans who were, by a pretty strong majority, about 2/3, if not more, of Koreans wanted the president to be impeached. And when the Conservative Party boycotted the Assembly, they found themselves, the Conservatives, on the back foot, as you might expect. We then had to wait yet another week for a repeat vote. But this time, I think reflecting the fact that public opinion was so strongly opposed to what had happened, the vote was carried.
So I suppose the follow-on question, John, is why did he do it?
Why did he do it? Okay, there are lots of different potential reasons. The proximate cause, as they say, right, the initial impression, and in fact what he tried to say was that the opposition was being unduly obstructive. It had sought to vote down his budget that he was trying to pass through the National Assembly. It had launched investigations into the alleged illegal activities of the president's wife, who had been accused of insider trading, as well as trying to influence the selection of candidates for the National Assembly election that had taken place in the spring of last year, which had returned this big Democratic Party majority. And some of those efforts had been blocked by the governing Conservative Party, at which point the Democrats sought to impeach some of Yoon's own officials, which led the president in turn to say, the opposition is overreaching. The opposition is if you like, a democratic tyranny. They are themselves playing fast and loose with the rules of the political game, and therefore they're illegitimate. And therefore I'm going to send them a signal by introducing martial law to basically warn them from continuing with this disruptive political activity. That's an unconvincing argument, I would say. And I think we'll obviously have to wait for the verdict of history. I think there's a deeper reason here, which is it's true that the opposition was acting to block the president's actions. But this comes on the back of 2.5 years or thereabouts of political failure on the part of President Yoon. A whole series of measures that he had sought to introduce that had not been successful. His popularity was flatlining already in the low teens, which by Korean standards is tantamount to almost an unsustainable political position. In the autumn of last year, it looked as if even members of his own party were turning against him. He was seen as so unpopular. He had sought to introduce new reforms to the medical system that were generating a lot of unrest from medical doctors. Price inflation was undermining his standing with the Korean public. And therefore, an alternative explanation was that this was just an attempt to deflect from his own bad news at home politically. And therefore, he was using the martial law action to try and reset the political environment. There's a third reason, which I think is perhaps the more fundamental reason, and perhaps the most interesting one when we think about the dynamics of Korean politics, which is that President Yoon, throughout his tenure as president, has never seen the opposition as legitimate. And in fact, if you go back to some of his public speeches, 2 years ago, he gave a speech on August 15th, National Liberation Day. It's a critically important day in the Korean political calendar. It marks the liberation of Korea from 35 years of Japanese colonial domination. In that speech, President Yoon talked about the forces of the left in South Korea as effectively fellow travelers with North Korea, as disloyal, pro-North Korean sympathizing, anti-state forces. And in fact, he's used that same language to describe the Democratic Party today. It is almost hard really to sort of bring to the attention of a Western audience just how historically anomalous this seems. It's almost as if you have a McCarthyite discourse going on in South Korean politics between a deeply conservative president who sees the left as essentially illegitimate. And in fact, since the impeachment fiasco and the martial law controversy blew up, President Yoon has doubled down on that argument. He sought to reinforce this claim that the left are anti-state forces. He suggested, for example, that those National Assembly elections from last April might have been marred by illegal activity. He suggested that China might have been behind efforts to tilt the election in the direction of the Democratic Party. He's suggested that the Democratic Party has been working with North Korea. Now, there's no evidence for this, none whatsoever. The National Electoral Commission declared the election to be free and fair. It was a decisive victory for the Democratic Party. So Yoon seems to be grabbing at straws to support this argument. It's all fueled as well by social media in South Korea that is on steroids. There is a YouTube proliferation of right-wing as well as left-wing channels, it has to be said, that peddle a whole series of conspiracy theories. And President Yoon seems to have an appetite for these YouTube discussions. And that may also have influenced him in making these, frankly, outlandish arguments.
John, there's so many different follow-up questions that I'm sure we've both got. I'm actually going to ask a question for the sake of completion, which is where we are now, because it's not resolved at all, is it? Or is it?
No, it's not resolved.
Yeah.
The impeachment vote has to be confirmed by South Korea's constitutional court. They have the responsibility to look at the motion and decide whether or not to uphold it. And in fact, they had their very first meeting, official meeting, today, January 14th, which lasted all of 4 minutes. Essentially, the process is now underway. It can take up to 180 days. That's as much time as they have. I suspect it will not run that long. And the justices that sit on the Constitutional Court, a full complement for the court is 9 members. When this process started, to add even more complexity to what is already a complicated story, when it first started, there were only 6 sitting members of the Constitutional Court. Now, in order to make a judgment, in theory, the court, to be quorate, needs 7. Interestingly, it is the National Assembly that decides, or at least nominates, members of the Constitutional Court. So immediately you can understand the difficulty that this posed. In order to make this decision, the political process within the National Assembly involving the Democrats and the Conservative parties needed to go forward to ensure that there would be a full complement of members sitting on the Constitutional Court. Once President Yoon had been impeached, an acting president took over. Han Duck-soo, the prime minister, stepped into that role through the normal political, if you like, line of succession. And it was expected that Han Duck-soo, as a pretty moderate conservative, would simply do the decent thing and appoint more justices to the Constitutional Court to ensure that they could do their due diligence. Unfortunately for political stability in South Korea, acting President Han announced that he would not appoint those additional justices unless there was consensus between the governing Conservative Party and the opposition Democrats. At this point, the Democrats, in turn, accused Han of obstructionism and suggested that he might have been in cahoots with President Yoon to block this process going forward. So what did they do? They impeached him. They impeached the acting president and successfully removed him from office. This in and of itself was also contentious because as the president, the impeachment rules would suggest that you need a 2/3 majority of the National Assembly in order to remove a president. But because he was the acting president, the Democrats independently decided that all they needed was a simple majority, not a 2/3 majority, which then in turn generated fierce opposition from the Conservatives, accusing the Democrats of overreaching. However, political power is based on numbers, and Han was impeached and suspended, and then was in turn succeeded by the next in the line of succession, acting President Choi Sang-muk, the economics and finance minister, who is now currently effectively running the country. And he in turn appointed or approved the appointment of 2 additional justices to the Constitutional Court. So they can now do their job. And that's what they've been trying to do.
And there are protests on the street still with demonstrators on both sides. Now, I mean, is it the case, because John, we were chatting before and you said, the day it happened, you were there and you went on the streets and nobody really knew what was going on. And, it's obviously now become much more of an entrenched political problem with organised demonstrations on both sides in a way that it wasn't initially on the day of the declaration of martial law.
Yes, I mean, I should point out that Seoul is a large city. I was in the north of the city, near the Blue House, which is the old site of the president's office and where all the major government buildings, the US Embassy and so on are concentrated, in an area called Gwanghwamun, which is where many of these demonstrations typically have taken place in the past. Listeners may remember that back in 2016-17, there were huge so-called candlelight demonstrations against the government of then President Park Geun-hye, who herself was impeached in 2017 and removed from office and sentenced to about 24 years in imprisonment. The National Assembly is in the south of the city, some distance away from where I was. And that's where the demonstrations, or at least the efforts to protect the National Assembly, were initially concentrated. The demonstrations that have taken place since then have been concentrated in the north and at the National Assembly, and most importantly, outside the president's personal residence, where he is holed up, facing, and this is where the story gets a little bit more complicated.
Just, John, which president? The original President Yoon?
President Yoon.
Yeah.
President Yoon, the man who is suspended but is accused of having acted in an extra-constitutional action and potentially in a treasonous manner by introducing martial law. So why are there demonstrations? Why are there large numbers of Koreans outside his personal residence? Because parallel to the political process that the Constitutional Court is ruling on, there are efforts to launch a criminal investigation of President Yoon, a separate investigation that is being carried out by a body called the Corruption Investigation Office. And they have sought his arrest. They want to bring him in for questioning to try and find out what actually happened on December 3rd and what was behind the martial law decision. So you've got two parallel tracks happening at the same time. And the diehard conservative supporters of President Yoon, who are lined up outside his personal residence, are arguing that he should not be arrested. That this is, again, they would claim, the Democrats, overreaching, and that the Corruption Investigation Office is itself acting in ways that are extra legal. The office would argue that they have a warrant supported by a local court. They almost certainly do. What I would say, perhaps the best way to explain this, is that President Yoon knows that he has no exit strategy. He knows that the legal and political process will almost certainly, once the court makes its ruling, lead to his removal from office, because the scale of his offence is so large that it's almost inconceivable that they won't support this decision. He will, of course, and he has deployed his lawyers to the Constitutional Court, try and make an argument to justify his actions. In fact, some of the arguments that are likely to be made and are already being entertained are rather fanciful, citing, for example, Donald Trump and his immunity from prosecution and the actions of the US Supreme Court in granting him immunity during his time as president. Now, of course, from a legal perspective, that's completely fanciful. This is an entirely separate polity. And yet, this gives you a sense of just how extreme the arguments that are being deployed by President Yoon and his conservative supporters are. And by surrounding himself with supporters and his, what I would describe his Praetorian Guard, the Presidential Personal Security Division, he has blocked successfully efforts by the police and the Corruption Investigation Office to bring him in for questioning.
I was going to ask, I was interested in this thing that he was sort of trying to draw some sort of parallel or analogy with Trump. And is the Constitution of South Korea, is it modeled on the American Constitution?
It has a mixture of different features. Some American,
right?
The fact that it has a Supreme Court. It was established in 1948.
Right.
And it has worked with varying degrees of success. And of course, it's been modified over time as a result of interventions by authoritarian leaders since then. But it should, in working practice, be able to deliver a political outcome that is going to be fair and transparent. But one of the big problems that South Korea faces at the moment is a lack of public confidence in the institutional guardrails that govern politics. Populism has been a key element in the contest between the left and the right. And perhaps in all of this, one office that remains very important is the office of the prosecutor, and prosecutors in general. Prosecutors have largely been a law unto themselves and have been deployed and used by both progressive and conservative politicians in the past to go after their political rivals. There is a profound irony here in that President Yoon, before becoming president, was himself the special prosecutor appointed by his predecessor, a progressive politician, Moon Jae-in, to carry out a series of legal investigations into individuals associated with Park Geun-hye, that former conservative president who was impeached in 2017. So the man who was brought in to effect the rule of law, to ensure that people would be held to account, is now himself mired in his own battle with other legal officers. And I think, again, it's a further indication of just how complicated the process is, but also how little faith ordinary Koreans have in the institutional conventions of South Korean politics.
I want to ask a question about martial law, because the thing about martial law is that it involves the military. And the question that often occurs at any times of political instability or revolution is which side the military is going to take, and particularly relevant in the American context as well from January the 6th time, whether the military will follow orders. So in this list of people who are influential, I don't know where whatever the Korean version of Chief of Defence Staff is or sits. I mean, you talked about the Praetorian Guard, but who is really in control of what the military decides to do?
So we know now that on December 3rd, when President Yoon declared martial law, he was working closely with the Minister of Defence, the head of the Defence Intelligence Command, who is a senior military official, not the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, if you like, or the equivalent, but pretty prominent and significant in the military chain of command. And both individuals seem to have been firmly aligned with the president in supporting his declaration and supporting the deployment of troops to the National Assembly. And that, of course, was extremely worrying to have people of such senior status backing this action. We also know that shortly before the martial law declaration was announced, the president convened his cabinet, as he is required to do in order to introduce martial law, to, well, probably not to consult, but certainly to inform them of his decision. And from what we know, and it's hazy because the historical record is unclear, significant numbers of the cabinet opposed his decision, with the exception of the defense minister, but he went ahead nonetheless. What is also interesting to note is that the individual who is in charge of coordinating those troops at the National Assembly, at least according to people I spoke to at the time when I was there in South Korea for that week, mindful of the seriousness of what was happening, had given fairly explicit instructions to those troops not to use violence against National Assembly members. In fact, some had suggested that they had been issued with rifles without ammunition. Again, the record here is not immediately clear, but there's no doubt that there was restraint carried out by those individuals. And perhaps that reflects the importance of key individuals who were there at the time. Perhaps it also reflects the changed culture of those conscripts who had been deployed, ordinary young South Koreans, who recognized what they were actually getting into and weren't willing necessarily to support the president in his actions. But this is all part of the investigation that is now being carried out, criminal and political, to try and find out what had actually happened. If you organize a coup, you would think that you would put in place not only strong military control, but also manage the means of communication. In fact, talking to one senior Democratic politician at the time who had previously, in his earlier career, been a member of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as he said to me very graphically, remembering his experiences of 1980 when he was sitting in the foreign ministry, we knew something was up because all of our communications were severed back in 1980. This time, however, the lines of communications continued. Just to give you one nice illustration, I think, about how modern technology makes managing a coup a much more difficult proposition than it used to be. Lee Jae-myung, the leader of the Democratic Party, live-streamed his arrival on his mobile phone at the National Assembly on that critical night when he was bringing together the members of his party to vote against martial law. All the national broadcasters were reporting live on television what was happening. And this, of course, helped to mobilize public opinion against the president. So it looks as if there was a great deal of incompetence and lack of thoughtful preparation on the part of the president. Although, as more and more information comes out, we now have suggestions that the president was talking about an imminent decision to launch martial law, perhaps as long as 6 months ago. Such was his frustration with the opposition party.
Sorry, I mean, it does seem to have been extraordinarily badly. I mean, one would have thought the first thing you do is you shut down basically various telecommunication networks or control them, and he clearly hadn't done anything. I mean, it didn't seem that he had a very good idea of how to do this. And I am struck actually by what you were saying about the strength of the social media in South Korea. I'm pleased to see that, you know, the sort of paranoia that can generate seems to be something that seems to be affecting them too. I thought they might be a little bit more immune than we are to all this sort of chitter chatter that goes on social media. But
no, I mean, it's much more prevalent. You know, only about polls, and polls, of course, are always suspect, but polls suggest that ordinary Koreans, only about 31% of Koreans have confidence in what we would describe as legacy media, traditional media outlets.
That's fascinating, actually. I mean, it's really interesting. What I wanted to ask also, John, is to sort of pull back a bit. What are the wider geopolitical ramifications for this? I mean, are the North Koreans looking very curiously at their southern brethren? I mean, what is the impact in a broader regional sort of dynamic, really?
Well, initially, the North Koreans were surprisingly restrained. We didn't hear very much from them in the immediate aftermath of the declaration, nothing. And I think the reason for that is that they didn't want to give President Yoon any pretext or excuse to support his actions. And in fact, in that critical first week before the impeachment vote in the National Assembly, I was talking to one senior South Korean academic who was convinced that President Yoon would pick an opportunity to provoke a crisis with North Korea in order to legitimize his martial law declaration. And there, in fact, is some evidence, again, it's circumstantial, to suggest that this might have been tried in the past. You may recall that a few months ago, there were North Korean drones seen over Seoul, and also reports that the South Korean military had deployed drones over Pyongyang. Now, there's been recent testimony in the last few days in the National Assembly by senior intelligence officials who have neither confirmed nor denied that those drones were deployed. So it's a very worrying situation if a president is seeking wag the dog style to provoke a crisis with a neighbor in order to legitimize his extra-constitutional actions. The North Koreans, I think, therefore, have recognized the importance of exercising restraint. But of course, talking to you today, it's worth pointing out that this morning in Seoul, North Korea launched a barrage of short-range missiles into the East Sea. And on January 6th, launched a hypersonic missile with a range of at least 1,000 kilometers, sufficiently long to target US forces on Guam. Now, is this related to the political upheaval in South Korea? Is it related to the incoming Trump administration? Is North Korea positioning itself to perhaps negotiate with Washington, given that there are signs from senior officials around Donald Trump that he might be minded to do this? Certainly, all of this, to talk about the geopolitics, all of this upheaval in South Korea is a huge opportunity for North Korea to advance its diplomatic and political and security interests. It also undermines South Korea's credibility at a key moment as an alliance partner of the United States. It exposes South Korea to the potential bargaining pressure from a transactional Donald Trump. And for South Korea's immediate neighbor, Japan, and I spent a week in Japan after my week in South Korea, this political crisis was seen as further confirmation of the unreliability of the political leadership in South Korea and was creating a profound sense of anxiety on the part of politicians and senior members of the Japanese foreign ministry, who themselves are grappling with their own problems. They have minority government under Prime Minister Ishiba. They themselves are politically weak. And all of this is adding up to one unholy geopolitical mess for the Western alliance, such as it is, and for these two key long-standing alliance partners of the United States, which is why we saw Secretary of State Blinken last week travel to Seoul to reinforce, as he has said publicly, the ironclad commitment of Washington to the ROK-US alliance relationship to try and create stability. And I have to say that I think acting President Choi is doing a good job at trying to provide reassurance, because the fear is, to come back to your question, Ali, is that the North Koreans will try and exploit this and create a further crisis.
And so, John, when you talk about this, it's a natural thing for us to start making parallels because there are parallels, and there's obviously parallels with America. There's parallels with France, I think, where the presidential system, it's the same problem in a way, which is that tension between a president and a parliament and how they are reconciled. And then you talk about the social media and the populism, and there's a bit of me that thinks, is this just a really obvious warning signal that South Korea is just a little bit more advanced than a few other countries who've got the same thing coming down the line? I mean, should we be drawing important conclusions from this? And I suppose the question is a stupid one, because even if we do, what can we do about it? Because we're saying that you have this sort of conflation of social media fueling populism, politicians using that for their own ends, and then enemies in whatever form poised to exploit it. That's just the state we're in, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, this kind of division between left and right in South Korea is not new. It's been there for a long time, but it's been exacerbated by recent political crises, including those previous impeachment efforts, and because of the prevalence of street politics. But every crisis is also an opportunity, and it is actually generating a discussion on the part of more sober-minded politicians, both on the left and the right. And I have to say also, it's worth keeping in mind that the left is also guilty of playing the populist game. You know, we've seen the acting president, just today, in fact, visit the National Assembly to try and show the importance of creating bipartisan consensus to try and get through this crisis. There's been talk about institutional reform. South Korea has a one-term, 5-year presidency, and that's one of the key weaknesses in the political system, because there's no incentive on the part of incumbents to try and reach across the political aisle to create enough support to sustain a second term. And there has been periodic talk about political reform to allow a 2-term presidency to operate. The division of power between the National Assembly and the presidency, has led to these sort of cohabitation style scenarios that have never really worked very well in South Korea. And that's, again, part of the problem. I don't think we're going to see radical political change to challenge the division of power between the presidency and the National Assembly. And of course, that's a good thing, given South Korea's authoritarian past. You need checks and balances. And I think out of this process, if the Constitutional Court does its job right and upholds this decision, then the system will have been seen to have worked. But without South Korean public showing up to express their discontent, it's sometimes not clear that the politicians really take seriously their responsibilities. And that reflects the weaknesses of party systems. Parties are very volatile, fluid, they come and go, and personal loyalties in a political system that is very hierarchical mean that grassroots political action takes place at the street level rather than through the existing institutional functioning mechanisms of party politics. And that is a major weakness in South Korea.
So do we think it's all going to settle down? Or do we? I don't know, John. I mean, it seems like you're describing something which opens our eyes to an instability which I think we didn't realize was there in South Korea. I think for the majority of us who live far away, we thought, well, South Korea, Western style democracy, very modern, quite trendy, all's well. And what you're talking about is just every element of it. There's just this point where it might not be quite so.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow on from that, it's interesting because, there's been this long debate, of course, about, codified, quote, written constitutions and unwritten constitutions and how flexible they can be to sort problems out. And this seems to be a case study of a constitution that's a written constitution that is structurally somewhere something's gone wrong. But even then, what you've been telling us is they've actually circumvented what is written in the written constitution and, gone from a 2/3 majority to a straight majority to do the things they need to do. So it seems to me that the only way out for them, but obviously that is a question for you, really. I mean, the only way is to have some sort of constitutional convention and sort out some of the anomalies in the constitution that has got them into this pickle. I mean, it seems a bit, it's Suzanne's saying, when the way you're discussing it or the way it seems to be unfolding in South Korea, there's no immediate solution, is there? I mean, it's not, it's a much more structural problem. I mean, is that right? Or
yes and no. I mean, yes, it's true that structural reform is a necessary part of the reform process in order to stabilize Korean politics, but it's not sufficient. And I think this brings us back to the question, well, what is at the heart of the populist dynamic? Jan Werner Müller, the kind of high priest of populism, describes the kind of one of the key elements of populism as this moralistic dimension, the tendency to think in very emotive terms and to talk about politics in very emotive terms, and the sort of self-righteous way in which political adversaries defend their own positions. And that, I would say, is one of the most defining, prominent features of South Korean politics. It's always been there, and yet it's become amplified, again, partly due to social media and because of the legacy of history and these deep-seated grievances. So politicians on both sides of the aisle talk about combating evil. It's part of the discourse. President Moon used the same language when he was president about eradicating evil from the political landscape. And President Yoon, in talking about criminal anti-state forces, is basically saying that the left is illegitimate. And I don't know how you get beyond that. How do you get people to actually see themselves as common members of the body politic rather than as some sort of political bacillus that is attacking the state? And I think for that, we need to really explore the psychology of politics and how to create fora in which people can see themselves as common participants in the political project rather than see themselves as implacable adversaries. And of course, the existence of North Korea and the sense of distrust that exists in politics because of the unique situation that exists on the Korean Peninsula, the fact that the North advances its interests not only through its military hardware, but through subversion, through cyber interventions, obviously creates a climate in which fear and anxiety also fuel this emotional politics. So you need, I think, responsible leaders who can make the argument not only for institutional change, but also the importance of acknowledging that all South Koreans are part of a common political project. One of the challenges, I think, in Korean politics is that there are two competing historical narratives. One is the narrative of economic dynamism and exceptionalism that we associate with conservatives, and particularly with those authoritarian leaders like Park Chung-hee, who created the miracle on the Han River. And the other historical narrative is the narrative of democratic revolution, if you like, and democratic reform that is embraced by the left. Now, both are equally valid, but the partisans on both sides focus more exclusively on one over the other. And we need moderate politicians who can say, we can bring these two competing images of our history together in a way that will stabilize the country.
John, we're out of time, but that was completely fascinating and very thought-provoking, particularly for those, for most of us who live in countries which have some of these problems, if not exactly the same, but elements of it. And the observations you made just then about populism, I think, are relevant much more broadly. And so it's been brilliant to hear you explain it so clearly. And we wish South Korea well in sorting this out.
Don't we all? Yes.
We certainly do.
So thank you. That's it from us for today. So it's thank you and goodbye from me.
Thank you, John.
Thanks a lot. Nice talking.
Until next time.